Okay, so we're off to a great start. Since probably none of you know who I am, but mostly because I love talking about myself, I'm going to start off with a brief introduction. So, I came to this school back in 2009 to study game design and programming. At the beginning of 2010, I teamed up with my good friend Robin Flodin to make the game Dwarfs. By some miracle and a lot of bribes, we managed to win Game of the Year at the Swedish Game Awards. A year later, we released Dwarfs, and I teamed up with Fred Ström and Vilja Svensson to make the action RPG Secret of Grindea. A year later, that game scored me my second Swedish Game Award victory. The game got greenlit, and we got a bunch of other quite positive press. Today, I'm still working on this bloody, lovely game, while money from Dwarfs is keeping me alive. So, if we ignore the law of Jante for a moment, one might suggest that my time here was quite successful, right? And I believe that this kind of success could be replicated year after year by students only by following a certain set of principles and philosophies. That's what I'm going to talk about today. So the name of the talk is Make Games Now. And when I say make games, I'm not talking about the kind of games you make for school. I'm not talking about the games you make to impress teachers. I'm talking about games you make in order to make money, like real games. And to do this, I'm first going to have to shatter the illusion that many students have that when you are a student, you can't make something real, you can't make something commercial. And when I've done that, I'm going to speculate around what games are better suited for the purpose of learning and breaking into the industry than others. And I'm going to talk about some very common pitfalls that a lot of students repeatedly fall into again and again. And on the off chance that someone is still awake by then, I'm going to answer questions. So, before I can tell you anything useful, I'm going to have to address a sort of self-image issue that plagues the student demographics. And that's the idea that when you are a student, you're not allowed to be a professional. And I've been in contact with a lot of students, not only when I was a student here myself, but also when I've been invited to the Swedish Game Awards to talk, or when I've been invited back here as an alumni. And I always try to tell students that you should make games, and you should make them as if you are going to release them. And the response I almost always get is something like, but I'm a student. If I knew how to make games, I wouldn't be here in the first place. And that sounds like a pretty good point. If you're a lawyer, you don't go to law school. Doesn't make sense. But as it turns out, in this occupation, it only makes sense if you assume that by the end of your education, you somehow magically are bestowed upon the powers to create games. You suddenly learn everything you need to know. And it's a good point if you believe that to be a professional, you can't have anything left to learn. And it's an absolutely fantastic point if all you want are the Season 3 rewards in League of Legends. It's not, however, a great point if what you want to do while you go here is learn how to make games. So let's examine the statement. If I could make games, I wouldn't be here. First off, let me assure you that everyone in here have the capacity to learn how to make games, without exception. All you really need to know is what tools are suited for your goals and your ambitions and your current knowledge. There's a horde of these things out there this day and age. For example, if you don't want to learn any programming at all, Construct is entirely event-based, and Cognac, for example, is making really great games only using construct. If you don't know who Cognac is, you should look him up. Game Maker requires some basic scripting, but it's almost at the level of construct, and as I understand it, the game jam tomorrow will be focused around using Game Maker, so you should definitely check that out. Flash and Unity requires a bit more knowledge of scripting, but they still have visual interfaces, which makes game making a lot easier and accessible. If you really love the look of Visual Studio, you can take a gander at C# with XNA or C++ with SFML if you want to make your own game logic from scratch. So the truth is, with tools like these, even idiots can make games. And speaking about idiots, let's talk about me. So that's me with less hair. Before I got to this education, I had studied one small class of C++ and one short class of PHP. After being here for 4 months, I made Dwarfs. And this doesn't really compute, does it? Like, where did I learn to make games? Two of these months are math and Swedish, so it's really an enigma. I like the theory that I'm a genius, but I can assure you that's not true. So maybe the C++ course was really good, but it wasn't, it sucked. So where in the hell did I learn how to make that game? And the truth, the secret is, before making Dwarfs, I had no idea how to make games. Even when I made Dwarfs, I had no idea how to make games. And that's the thing that you learn as you go along. And attending lectures and doing your courses are great. You learn a lot from just going to class. But the thing is, those courses are by nature very narrow, right? The breadth of knowledge you'll attain from making an entire game, a real game, like making it as if you're going to release it, it's almost not comparable. There is no academic substitute for many of the things you'll learn by making an entire game on the side. Because of this, not only can you make games right now, but you must make games for this education to be at all useful in the end. If you go through here, just barely passing courses, I can assure you that you won't leave without anything else than a bunch of debt and a bachelor degree in being unemployed. So, okay, you get it. I think you should make games. So, I think you understand now. I think this part of the statement is quite silly, but you haven't heard me talk about this part yet. So, to really appreciate how stupid this part, I wouldn't be here if I could make games, is we first have to determine where here is. So basically, you're stuck on an island with about 100 other people in school, wanting to learn how to make games, while CSN is giving you money to not die. And the fact that there's a, look, there's a fucking laser pointer. The fact that there's a classroom in this picture just blinds people. It's amazing. The idea of studentship, of the principle of being a student, makes people, like, puts up all sorts of walls when it comes to what people think they can and cannot do. So, as a thought experiment, let's remove the school. I know you can't, unfortunately, remove school for real, but let's just see how this picture looks without the classroom. So in that case, what you say is, if I could make games, I wouldn't want to be on an island surrounded by people wanting to make games while some suckers are paying our rent, which is CSN. And no sane game developer would actually say this. But this is all kind of philosophical. And to not feel as much as a hippie, I'm going to talk about this in more economical terms. So making games now, rather than, say, in 5 or 10 years. Some people kind of accept what I've been saying until this point, but they feel like, okay, yeah, I get what you're saying, but I think I'm going to wait for a bit. I'm going to work for a few years, and then if I want to make my own games, I'm going to make them with more experience than I am now. And that sounds pretty reasonable, but when you actually look at it, you almost can't compare them. Well, obviously you can compare them because that's what I'm going to do, but they're two very different things, and what you see is quite remarkable. So, okay, let's pretend you work in the industry for 5 to 10 years, and suddenly you go, nuh-uh, you can tell me what to do. I'm going to make my own game. And the thing is, in this industry, only Valve and Might and Delight don't force you to work overtime. So it's almost impossible to make a game on your free time. So you're probably going to have to quit your job. On the other hand, now you have no job to quit. In fact, it's your job to learn how to make games. Making games takes time and money, or it takes time, and not dying takes money. So you're going to burn through your savings quite quick. On the other hand, now CSN is covering your ass. So you don't have to worry about saving up money or burning through savings, right? And lastly, if you fail, which is a definite possibility, you will have wasted your time, at least compared to still being employed, right? But if you're here, you're going to be here anyway, so it's only a question of if you use your time smartly. And if you compare these two side by side, right, you see quite clearly how absolutely devastating the first scenario can be, right? Has no consequences at all. Let's pretend that you work for 5 years. It's the difference between risking destroying your life and just being more attractive to employers, right? So the worst case scenario, you work that year, and then serious the game isn't complete. And I'm not talking about serious games like that has devastating consequences on your life, right? I'm talking about. But trying to make a game now, if you make those now, has no consequences at all. Worst case scenario, so your portfolio is looking better and you improve. It's the difference between risking destroying your life and best case scenario, you can being more attractive off the boat because you won't need it because you're making your own money. If you make serious games now, and quite obviously, I believe that the only sane course of action while attending this education is to make money. If you make seriously try to make worst case scenario, your portfolio is looking better, and I think it's ridiculous a job, right? To let this best case go because you can throw that portfolio off the boat. Very unlikely you won't need it because you're making your own money. Something even remotely like it ever again in your life. Quite obviously, I believe in games the only sane course of action while attending this education is you're supposed to abuse seriously try to make. And you better be quick about it because this shit gets patched at graduation day. So, okay, I want you to make games. But I'm not done telling you what to do. I'm going to tell you what games to make as well. Because I believe there are better and worse games you could spend your time with. I will say that making games at all is infinitely better than not making games. But many students sort of waste time and potential doing things that are less evolving than what they could be doing. And basically what this boils down to is innovation versus execution, something which makes some people pretty pissed. So a very common advice I hear people get, that at least I got when I went here, is make games now that you won't be able to make after you graduated. And what people mean by this is basically make experimental and artsy games now, because when you graduate you'll have to make money. And I don't like this advice. I don't think it's good. I think it's harmful sometimes. Not because I don't like experimental games. In fact, I love experimental games. I really enjoy walking around and trying out like wacky ideas that students have realized. But sadly, I'm pretty sure you're not here to amuse me at GGC. I suppose you're here to learn how to make games. And to that end, my counter proposition to this is to make games as if you're going to sell them. which almost inherently means I value execution vastly more than I value innovation. You can have both, but your focus point, in my opinion, should always be on execution, right? So, to try to convince you why that is, let me give you a few examples. So, first off, when you make a gimmicky game, people don't know what to expect, right? So, you won't have at all as much pressure to get that game mechanic as polished as it could be, because people just go like, hey, yeah, this is cool, and they won't really care or analyze that you have a bad presentation or like unpolished game. But if you make something where people have some kind of frame of reference, suddenly the need to make it actually good becomes much greater. You can no longer hide behind the silliness or novelty of things. Also, when you make a game that's gimmicky, you learn a lot on how to design and implement this specific feature, right? And this is good. You will learn a lot, but the thing is, learning how to execute, learning how to polish is something that's always important. Say you make a gimmicky Kinect game or whatever. You will learn how to some basic Kinect implementation. And that's great if you're going to apply for a project that requires Kinect, right? But if you make a game that's thoroughly compelling, that's well thought out, well implemented, like has tight, coherent graphics, then that's going to be interesting in whatever project you want to make, right? Whatever job you want to apply for. And here's almost perhaps the most important part to me. You will naturally get a lot of chances to jog your creativity by just going to this school. Almost every game design assignment you'll have will somehow be tied to innovation. Like back in my days, I hope you still have that, there was a rapid prototyping course pretty much dedicated to learning how to be creative and innovate on certain themes. But you never, almost never, have built-in chances to practice polish. And the thing is, I don't even think many of you appreciate what I'm saying when I'm talking about polish as a feature. It's very easy to think that if a game isn't fun or doesn't really pop out to you, surely there must be something wrong with the game design, right? Because if you have implemented what the game design document says, then it should work. But that's seldom the case. It's really hard to appreciate this without having experienced it. Like some artists, you have a ball and a wall, and when the ball collides with the wall, someone says, hey, shouldn't there be some kind of visual effect when this happens? And some artists go like, what is that? Or if you're a programmer, maybe you've made this intricate menu system and you're really proud this main menu, it works, it does things. And then someone comes along and says, hey, shouldn't there be some kind of transition between the menus? And the programmer's head just explodes because he haven't thought of that and it doesn't work in his code. Those things needs to be experienced, and the only way to experience those in the context of this education will be to get that experience on your own. Furthermore, polish and execution is probably the most important things in all commercially viable games, right? It's polish, which will win you SGA, and it's polish, which will score you that job you want, and it's polish that will move copies of your game on Steam. Because even with a pretty basic idea, if it's well executed, people will enjoy it. Whereas even the best idea, if poorly executed, will be worth nothing, right? So, all right? Now you understand that I want you to make games focused on execution. So I'm going to give you some advice on how to be able to focus on execution. I'm going to do this by telling you about some really common pitfalls that countless of students fall into all the time when selecting projects to work on. The most common issue is overscoping. And scope is basically all that you want your game to be. And scope determines how long it's going to take to make your game, right? And overscoping is when someone has this brilliant idea, like I'm going to make a first-person shooter MMO with destructible terrain and a politics system where the players shape the world, and it's not possible to make that games in 100 years. What you want to be, where you want to be, is on the almost opposite end of that spectrum, right? You want to make games that seem simple, that seem easy to make. I'm not talking about Pong, but I'm talking about something not way far away from Pong, closer to Pong than World of Warcraft. And the reason is, if you think a game is easy to make, it will be very difficult to make good. If you think a game is hard to make, it will be near impossible to make it good, right? So you want to keep your scope down because that's going to let you focus on making the game actually good. An example of a good scope would be Dwarfs, right? It's really simple. It's a simple mechanic. It has simple mechanics. There's no storytelling here. There's no campaign going on. We didn't need to implement cutscene and all that jazz. We thought this would take 6 months to make, and it took us a year, which doubled the time, but still within like the margin of error when you're attending an education, right? A really bad example, on the other hand, would be Secrets of Grindea. That's a very shitty game to be making on a 2 or 3 year education, because we thought it would take 2 years and it's going to take more than 4, which is way more than you have. The only reason I can make Secrets of Grindea now is because I made Dwarfs first. So, good scope, very bad scope. Okay. Another very common issue that's tied to overscoping is programmers wanting to build their own engines, and I'm specifically talking about rendering engines now. Learning how to build your own engines are great. It's a very good competence to have, and it's going to let you appreciate code a lot more. It's going to teach you things you wouldn't otherwise know, right? But building engines, on the other hand, is almost always bad for the end product, right? Because someone else have already done better than what you could do on your own in almost every case. So if you feel like you must, as a programmer, learn how to make rendering engines, do it as a hobby project on your own, or be very upfront about it, because there's nothing worse than being an artist wanting to make a game and teaming up with a programmer wanting to make an engine. And I'm saying this as a programmer. Another issue sort of tied with overscoping, and which will make people mad at me for saying, is that team size does not at all reflect your ability to how much of a game you can make. For every team member you add, beyond 2 or 3, beyond 2 I would say, the productivity of each member in that team will decline very rapidly. So you can't assume, as many does, that if you're a group of 8 people, you can do 4 times more of a game than if you were 2 people, because that's simply not the way it works. So be careful about bloating your teams. Also, if you're really hardcore about making a game that does make money, if your goal really is, as it was for me, I don't want to be employed, like I want to make my own games, then you should be very careful about this, because large teams have much more trouble sustaining themselves. Now, you can still work in large teams and make good stuff, but you should all be on the same page that the game you're making probably won't be able to support you, and you're only doing it to get a good portfolio, which is great, because many don't want to go the indie route. Many people just want to get employed. But if you do that, you need to be careful not to overscope through overconfidence, right? If you're 10 people, pretend that you're 4 when choosing a project to work on. Okay, so now you ask them, what games can we make? If we have all these restrictions, then we can't make any games anymore. Like, we can only make shitty games. Is what you might be thinking right now. But luckily, that's not quite the case. I'm going to list some examples of projects you theoretically could make in your time here. Dwarfs, obviously. Super Meat Boy. You maybe couldn't make the entire Super Meat Boy, but the basic principles are really simple, and it's a very well-received game. Faster Than Light, you could absolutely make right now if you only had the idea to do it. So again, a very basic concept, expertly crafted to be easy to make for a small team, right? Almost every design decision has had that in mind when making Faster Than Light. Binding of Isaac, also very simple, took less than a year to make for 2 people. There's nothing difficult to implement in Binding of Isaac. It's smartly designed, it's a roguelike to extend its playtime. So that's also something you could theoretically make. Resetia, which is a game about selling items to adventurers, is also a very simple, good focused core concept, which is executed well and can be made by very few people. This is Clash of Heroes, Might and Magic Clash of Heroes, which is a very clever puzzle game, still easy to implement. Right. Technically, you could make this game on 2 people if you had a couple of years, right? And this, by the way, is a great example of combining innovation and execution, because coming up with a new puzzle mechanics, that's certainly something an innovative person would want to do, right? And here's a nice example as well. This is cactuses, Swedish cactuses. Hotline Miami, thank you. Thank you, Marcus, for looking at me with that Hotline Miami look. So this game made Cactus Rich, and it also happens to be made in Game Maker, so there's that. So all these games have been, to some extent, fairly successful, right? Most of these games have made their creators millionaires, unfortunately not quite Dwarfs, but the others, and they are really tight scopes, right? So obviously you can make a lot even restricting yourself to small scopes. Okay, so to reiterate what this rambling has been all about, never wait to make games. Don't think like, oh, I can't make a game now, I have to get my degree first. And don't even wait until like the next course, like, hey, I can't make this game now, I have to learn how to game design first. Just try to make a game. Find a game you think you can make and then really try to make that game. Always value execution more than gimmicks. Innovation is fine as long as it doesn't get in the way of making good, polished games. You should always, in your mind, envision your game as a final product, and that entails everything, including like final polish, no placeholder sprites, complete menus, actually good-looking GUI and that jazz. When deciding on a project to make, always try to keep the scope as small as possible and never overestimate what you can do only because you're a lot of people in your team. Basically, make games and make them now. And that's it for me.
So, would you suggest that you should make commercially viable games for the courses that are made to make games such as Theme Park and Big Game Project? Or do you think that you should make them during the other courses and leave Theme Park and Big Game Project for innovative projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Making a commercially viable game isn't always compatible with the courses you're currently studying, right? So if you're attending courses like rapid prototyping, obviously you can't work on your big project right there. I think you should always be working on such a project, and if at all possible, and maybe Marcus will get pissed at me for saying this, but I don't give a shit. If possible, you should try to incorporate whatever game you have in those courses, right? The theme park arcade course is something I don't always approve of, because that's the best example of when the education itself imposes innovation on people. So, but you can still make games that you technically could sell within those restrictions, right? You could make just arcade controls for a game, and you can say, yeah, that's my innovation, because never ever sacrifice your best potential for learning for how well received your game is going to be as a part of a course. Like, as long as you pass the course at all, if you get what I'm saying. So don't sacrifice the game for innovation. But usually, most games you can actually sort of force into those project courses as well.
Okay, thank you.
I must have made a lot of sense, or I was really boring. There's one guy.
Yeah, so I've been working on at least a few projects on the side of the school, and I'm always trying to make them as polished as possible, as you say. But I have like no idea how I can make them commercially viable for me. So all I want to do is just get them up, on the internet for free, basically to learn for myself and to show others what I can do. So how do you feel about that?
I think that's an amazing idea. If like it's not every student who wants to make a commercially viable game. Like, every project won't get commercially viable. That's statistically simply not going to happen. Most games are not going to sell enough to support their creators, right? So what you should do at that point is just what you explained. Like, you should promote yourselves with the games, and you should throw them out at the public to learn, to get feedback and learn what you did wrong and right. When I don't know what games you make, but often when making games you have to restrict yourself quite a bit if you want them to be commercially viable, because some games simply have more trouble selling than others, right? So if you find yourself in a situation where you realize that, hey, okay, this game isn't going to sell, then it's way better to do what you do, which is give it out to people and make as many people as possible play it, than attempt selling it and not selling any copies at all. So I think what you do is absolutely what you should do in that situation. But maybe you could reevaluate what kind of games you make, if you want to make money on them, to find something that's more viable in the sense of making money.
Okay, thanks.
In making games, do you use the onion method in the beginning?
Oh, the layer upon layer.
Yeah.
thing. I have forgotten what that really means, to be quite honest
Well,
with
you start with a core who is like working, and then you put on another layer with another. So it's always, you can always fall back to the core who's with a working game.
Yeah, we basically combined like the onion method with the the frightening waterfall method, which everyone says you shouldn't do, and I agree. We use the onion method in that almost every part in the games we make could be like detached if it doesn't work. So yeah, it's a really good idea. The onion core is really nice to have. You should definitely go for that. In our case, I talk a lot about polish, right? In our case, we always do almost vertical slices after we've done prototyping. So some developers prefer to have an entire game that's almost unplayable because it's so unpolished, right? StarCraft 2 was one of those games. It's really amazing to see the development videos on that because it looks like shit and it barely played until the final year or so of several years of development. But in our case, like Secret of Grindea, is so it relies so much on feeling tight and being polished that we almost can't see how the game is going to feel before we put that layer on. So basically, it's a mixture of those two. I really like the core concept of the onion work method, but it's difficult to follow all the way through, in my experience.
Okay, thank you.
I just remembered one more thing. What did you make Dwarfs in, and how was it to make it in that engine?
Okay, I made Dwarfs with C# and XNA. And recommending XNA to people it's tricky because it is an amazing framework, right? But it is closed source and platform restricted. So I would say it was an amazing experience working with XNA, and I'm still working on XNA with Secret of Grindea because the scope is so big that for me as a single programmer to make it something else wouldn't be viable for me. So especially if you only want to make something that's good, but you don't necessarily want to reach out to every person in the world, so portfolio games, I could absolutely recommend XNA because it's a really good tool to work with. But you have to be aware of especially the platform restrictions you have. You could theoretically port the game with monogame and stuff, but it's more work than you think.
Would you rather recommend like starting out with Unity, GameMaker, and those other than starting with XNA and SFML and all those?
It's actually quite easy to learn, especially XNA, if you have some experience programming. So it kind of depends on what game you're going to make. So if you're going to make a 3D game, there's almost nothing I can recommend except Unity, right? Because it's so vastly superior in terms of how much you can produce and how easy the interface is. I mean, obviously the Unreal Engine is like far eclipses Unity, but then you have a much harder time actually making a game. So for 3D games, I would always recommend Unity. For 2D games, it's much more tricky because Unity really isn't very good at handling 2D games. So if you have like a basic grasp of programming, I would say making a 2D game in XNA is not a bad idea. Much because Unity uses the same language as XNA does. So if you want to switch over to Unity, you'll have learned, like everything you have learned in a programming sense will be applicable.
Thank you.